In the current Middle East conflict, what we are really observing is a strategic interaction between four major actors: the United States, Iran, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. Each of these actors has its own fears, ambitions, and strategic calculations. On the surface, they may appear aligned or opposed in clear ways. But when we examine their deeper interests, we begin to see that each one is pursuing its own version of victory. This is why analysts often describe the conflict not simply as a war, but as a multiplayer geopolitical game. In a normal two-player conflict, the goals are easier to understand. One side tries to defeat the other. But in a multiplayer game, every actor must constantly calculate how its actions affect all the others simultaneously. What strengthens one ally may weaken another. What appears to be cooperation might actually be competition hidden beneath the surface. This is the environment in which the current Middle East war is unfolding. Each country is attempting to shape the outcome of the conflict in a way that secures its own long-term strategic position. The first two players in this game are the United States and Iran. Their rivalry forms the central structure of the entire conflict. For decades, the United States has maintained a strong presence in the Middle East in order to protect its strategic interests, maintain regional stability, and ensure that the global energy system continues to function smoothly. One of the most important elements of this system is the flow of oil through the Strait of Hormuz. A huge portion of the world's oil supply travels through this narrow maritime corridor. Because modern economies depend heavily on energy supplies, any disruption to this route would have enormous consequences for global markets. For this reason, protecting the security of the Strait of Hormuz has been a major strategic objective for the United States. From Washington's perspective, Iran represents the primary challenge to this objective. Iran possesses both the geographic position and the military capability to threaten shipping routes in the Persian Gulf. It also has influence over several groups across the region that can pressure American allies. Because of these factors, American strategy has focused on limiting Iran's ability to project power beyond its borders. The United States aims to weaken Iran's influence so that it cannot dominate regional politics or threaten the international energy system. Iran, however, sees the situation very differently. From Tehran's point of view, the presence of American military forces around its borders represents a direct threat to its national security. Iran therefore attempts to counterbalance American power by developing its own regional influence and by demonstrating that it can impose costs on its adversaries. One of the ways Iran does this is by reminding the world that it has the ability to disrupt energy flows through the Strait of Hormuz. Even the possibility of such disruption creates uncertainty in global markets. This uncertainty becomes a strategic tool that Iran can use to influence the behavior of other countries. But the conflict becomes even more complex when we introduce the third player, Israel. Israel's interests overlap with those of the United States in several ways, yet they are not identical. Israel views Iran primarily as a direct security threat. Iranian missile programs and potential nuclear capabilities are perceived in Israel as dangers that could eventually threaten the country's survival. Because of this, Israel's strategy is focused on ensuring that Iran never reaches a level of military capability that could challenge Israel's security. Strategic simulations conducted by analysts often suggest that Israel's long-term objective is to weaken Iran's military infrastructure so significantly that it cannot recover for many years. This would preserve Israel's position as the strongest military power in the Middle East. Maintaining this advantage is essential for Israel because it provides deterrence against any coalition that might attempt to challenge it in the future. Therefore, while Israel cooperates closely with the United States, its ultimate objective is to maintain a strategic balance that guarantees its own security dominance. The fourth major player in this geopolitical game is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia and Iran have long been rivals for influence across the Gulf region. Both countries possess large energy resources and both seek leadership roles in the Middle East. From Saudi Arabia's perspective, Iran's expansion of influence across the region represents a significant threat. If Iran were able to dominate key energy routes or political alliances in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia's strategic position would be weakened dramatically. For this reason, Saudi Arabia often aligns itself with the United States and other partners who also wish to limit Iranian influence. However, Saudi Arabia's interests are not exactly the same as those of its allies. The kingdom's primary concern is the protection of its energy infrastructure and its ability to export oil to global markets. The entire Saudi economy depends heavily on this system. Any disruption to oil production or transportation could have severe consequences not only for Saudi Arabia, but also for global energy markets. When we examine these four actors together, we begin to see why the war is so complicated. Each participant is pursuing a different objective. The United States seeks to maintain stability in global energy systems and limit Iran's regional power. Iran seeks to challenge American influence and demonstrate that it cannot be easily pressured or isolated. Israel seeks to preserve its long-term military advantage and eliminate potential threats from Iran. Saudi Arabia seeks to protect its economic lifeline and prevent Iran from gaining influence across the Gulf. Because these objectives overlap and conflict in different ways, the alliances between these countries often appear contradictory. Countries that cooperate on one issue may compete on another. Actions taken to strengthen one ally might unintentionally create new problems for another. This is the nature of multiplayer geopolitical games. Every move generates consequences that ripple across the entire strategic landscape. Understanding this hidden game helps explain why events in the Middle East often seem confusing. What appears on the surface as a straightforward confrontation between enemies is actually the result of several different strategies unfolding simultaneously. Each country is calculating not only how to defeat its opponents, but also how to shape the behavior of its allies. This complex interaction creates a dynamic environment in which small changes can produce very large effects. In this environment, control of strategic locations becomes extremely important. The Strait of Hormuz is one of those locations. Because so much of the world's oil passes through this narrow passage, the ability to threaten or protect it carries enormous strategic weight. For Iran, the strait represents leverage. For the United States and its allies, it represents a vulnerability that must be defended. This single geographic point, therefore, becomes a central element in the broader strategic competition. When we analyze the conflict through this framework, we begin to understand that the war is not simply about territory or immediate military victories. It is about shaping the long-term balance of power in the region. Every action taken by one player forces the others to respond. Every response then creates new calculations and new strategies. The conflict becomes a continuous process of adjustment, adaptation, and strategic maneuvering. As the war continues, these interactions become even more complicated. Each country must decide how far it is willing to escalate the conflict in order to achieve its objectives. Escalation itself becomes a strategic decision. If one player pushes too aggressively, it may trigger responses that strengthen its opponents rather than weaken them. If another player shows too much restraint, it may appear weak and invite further pressure. Balancing these risks is one of the central challenges in international politics. This is why the conflict cannot be understood simply by looking at individual battles or military operations. The real story lies in the strategic calculations happening behind the scenes. Leaders in Washington, Tehran, Jerusalem, and Riyadh are constantly evaluating the same set of questions. How can they protect their interests? How can they limit the advantages of their rivals? And how can they shape the regional environment so that the final outcome of the conflict favors their own long-term goals? As these questions unfold, the hidden game between Israel and Saudi Arabia becomes especially interesting. On the surface, both countries appear aligned against Iran. They share concerns about Iranian influence and cooperate with the United States in various ways. Yet their motivations are not identical. Israel is primarily concerned with military threats and strategic deterrence. Saudi Arabia is primarily concerned with economic stability and energy security. These different priorities influence how each country approaches the conflict. Israel's focus on military capability means that it emphasizes actions designed to limit Iran's technological and strategic development. Saudi Arabia's focus on energy security means that it prioritizes protecting infrastructure and maintaining stable oil exports. Both goals intersect with the broader strategy of the United States, but they do not always align perfectly. This creates subtle tensions within the alliance structure. These tensions are not necessarily signs of weakness. In many ways, they are normal features of complex international systems. Alliances are rarely based on identical interests. Instead, they are built on overlapping objectives that may shift over time. As long as the core interests remain compatible, cooperation can continue even when disagreements appear on specific issues. The war in the Middle East, therefore, becomes a layered strategic interaction. At one level, it is a confrontation between Iran and a group of opposing states. At another level, it is a negotiation among allies about how the conflict should be managed. Each participant is trying to guide the outcome in a direction that benefits its own long-term position. When we recognize this hidden structure, many events that seem puzzling begin to make sense. Diplomatic statements, military deployments, and economic policies all become pieces of a larger strategic puzzle. Each move sends signals to multiple audiences at once. Some signals are directed at opponents, others at allies, and still others at domestic populations. The result is a geopolitical environment that is constantly shifting. Strategies evolve as new information appears and as players adjust their expectations. What looks like stability one moment can quickly transform into uncertainty the next. This constant adaptation is what makes the conflict so difficult to predict. Yet despite all this complexity, the underlying logic remains consistent. Each country involved in the conflict is ultimately trying to secure its own survival, influence, and prosperity. The United States wants to preserve the international systems that support global stability. Iran wants to ensure that it cannot be isolated or dominated by external powers. Israel wants to maintain its strategic security and military superiority. Saudi Arabia wants to safeguard the energy infrastructure that sustains its economy. These objectives form the foundation of the hidden game shaping the war. Every decision taken by these players reflects their attempts to balance risk and opportunity within this strategic environment. And as long as these competing interests remain unresolved, the conflict will continue to evolve in ways that reflect the calculations of each participant. Understanding these calculations does not necessarily allow us to predict every event that will occur, but it does provide a framework for interpreting the actions we observe. Instead of seeing isolated incidents, we begin to recognize patterns of strategy. Instead of assuming that alliances are simple and permanent, we see how they shift in response to changing circumstances. This perspective reveals that the war is not simply a series of confrontations. It is an ongoing strategic game in which every player is attempting to guide the outcome toward its own preferred future. And as long as the stakes remain this high, the moves within that game will continue to shape the political and economic landscape of the entire Middle East.